In the summer of 1958, long before machines were sleek and smart, before buttons replaced bolts, and engines came sealed instead of understood, the town of Redfield, Kansas still ran on dust, sweat, and stubborn metal. Tractors rattled awake at dawn. Radios crackled softly from kitchen windows. Folks repaired what broke because buying replacements was a luxury most couldn't afford. That was the year John was told to leave. He was 17, lean from growing too quickly and not eating enough, with dark hair that refused to stay neat and eyes that carried more years than his age. In school, teachers had labeled him gifted. In math, he solved problems in his head before chalk ever touched the board. In shop class, he grasped engines the way other boys understood baseball. He didn't just dismantle machines, he listened to them. But none of that mattered in the cramped kitchen of his stepfather's house. "You're smart," his stepfather said, standing by the sink, avoiding his eyes. "Smart enough to take care of yourself now." John's mother had passed 3 years earlier. Pneumonia one winter, one hospital bill too many. After that, the house grew quiet. Then his stepfather remarried. A new wife, 2 small children, and a new set of rules. "There's not enough room," the man said, "and you're not a kid anymore." John stood there holding a folded sheet of paper, his report card. Straight A's, mechanical drawing, algebra, physics. He had hoped it might make a difference. It didn't. By sunset, everything he owned was packed into a worn suitcase. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a pile of notebooks filled with sketches of engines and gears, a small screwdriver set he had saved for, and $37 earned from fixing radios around town. That was it. When the front door shut behind him, the sound felt final, like something permanent had ended. The road leading out of Redfield stretched flat and endless, lined with wheat fields and rusted fences. John walked with the suitcase in one hand and his thoughts in the other. He wasn't crying, not yet. One sentence kept echoing in his mind. "You're smart enough to take care of yourself." It sounded like praise. It felt like a verdict. Redfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everything about everyone. By morning, whispers would spread. "That's the boy who got kicked out." Some would feel sorry for him. Some would judge him. None would know what to do with him. John sat at the edge of the highway, watching trucks thunder past. The smell of oil and hot rubber filled the air. The sound of engines calmed him. Engines always made sense. People didn't. He thought about school. Senior year was supposed to begin in September. He had plans. College, engineering, building machines instead of just repairing them. Now he didn't even know where he would sleep. But one thing was clear. He didn't want to beg. He had skills. He just needed a chance to use them. That was when he noticed smoke rising from a nearby field. A tractor sat crooked in the dirt, its hood lifted, steam drifting upward like a tired breath. Beside it stood an older man, tall but slightly bent, wiping his hands on a rag. John hesitated, then walked toward him. "Sir," he said. The man turned, his face weathered and sunburned, shaped by years of wind and worry. "Machine trouble?" John asked. The man gave a short snort. "That thing's been trouble since Truman was president." John stepped closer, listening carefully. The engine ticked as it cooled. He crouched, studying the belts and hoses. "Your timing's off," he said cautiously. "And your fuel line's pulling in air." The man blinked. "You hear that just standing there?" John nodded. "It sounds hollow. Means it's not getting steady pressure." The man looked him over. "How old are you, son?" 17. "You a mechanic?" "No, sir. Just learned." The man paused, then let out a low, surprised laugh. "Well, I'll be damned." That was how John met Howard Blake. Howard let him tighten one bolt, then another, then replace a cracked line using a piece of rubber tubing from his truck. The engine sputtered, then caught. The tractor roared back to life. Howard stared at it like it had come back from the dead. "You got somewhere to go, kid?" John hesitated. "No, sir." Howard didn't ask anything else. "You can sleep in my tool shed," he said. "I've got work. Not much money, but I've got food." That night, John lay on a cot between sacks of seed and cans of oil. The smell of grease and hay filled the air. His stomach was full for the first time all day. For the first time since the door had closed behind him, he felt something close to relief. Howard Blake's farm was small. 2 tractors, 1 plow, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, but to John it felt like a laboratory. During the day he worked the fields. At night he took apart broken tools trying to understand why they failed. He sketched ideas in the margins of old newspapers and read manuals like they were novels.
Howard noticed. "You ever think about building your own machine?" he asked one evening. "All the time," John said. "Most folks just use them." John gave a faint smile. "They don't know how they work." In a world where machines were becoming more common but still mysterious, John saw patterns where others saw noise. He understood levers, ratios, pressure, and motion. What he didn't understand was why being smart hadn't saved him. Some nights, lying on his cot, he wondered if he should have tried harder to stay, if he should have begged. Then he remembered the look on his stepfather's face and knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't running away. He was being pushed forward. A week later, while hauling scrap into town, John noticed something behind the junkyard fence, a heap of rusted metal, old farm parts, gears, shafts, bent steel, and there, half buried in dirt, was something that made his heart stop. A core engine component from an older agricultural machine, the kind that once controlled the entire system. The part most people never saw, the part that mattered most. It was cracked, rusted, abandoned. But to John, it looked like possibility. He stood there staring at it, the sun burning his neck, his mind already racing through diagrams and solutions. He didn't know it yet, but that broken piece of metal was about to change his life. And this time, the cost wouldn't be rejection. It would be just a few dollars, and everything he had left. John didn't sleep much that night. The image of the rusted engine piece behind the junkyard fence kept replaying in his mind. He could still picture its shape in the dirt, half buried like the remains of some mechanical dinosaur. To anyone else, it was junk. To John, it was a heart waiting to beat again. At sunrise, he told Howard Blake he needed to go into town. "Something wrong?" Howard asked, pouring coffee into a chip mug. "No, sir," John said. "Something may be right." Howard squinted at him. "That sounds like trouble." John smiled. "The good kind." Redfield's junkyard sat on the edge of town, a crooked stretch of land surrounded by sagging wire fence. Old refrigerators leaned against broken plows. Truck doors lay stacked like fallen dominoes. Samuel Reed, the owner, was already there, sitting in a folding chair with a thermos and a newspaper. Thin, sharp-eyed, and always looking like he didn't trust anyone who smiled too much. "What are you looking for, kid?" he asked without lowering the paper. John pointed toward the back. "That engine piece near the fence." Samuel glanced over his shoulder. "That old thing's been sitting there since Eisenhower got elected." John climbed over a pile of axles and knelt beside it. Up close, the damage looked worse. Cracks along the casing, rust at the edges, but the inner structure was still intact. The geometry still made sense. He ran his fingers along the metal. It was the kind of part that controlled everything else, the piece that turned motion into purpose. If it failed, the whole machine failed. "Do you know what that is?" Samuel asked. "Yes, sir. It's the core unit from an older farm engine before the new models came out." Samuel snorted. "You got something that fits it?" "No, sir. Not yet." Samuel folded his paper and finally looked it in. "Then why do you want it?" John hesitated. "Because it still works. He just doesn't know it yet." Samuel laughed once. "You're a strange kid." "How much?" John asked. Samuel shrugged. "Couple bucks. $5. John reached into his pocket. The thin stack of bills felt lighter than it should. He handed over the money without arguing. As Samuel scribbled a receipt, he shook his head. "Most folks come here looking for things that still look useful. You pick the ugliest thing in the yard." John lifted the heavy part with both hands. "Sometimes the ugliest things are just unfinished." Back at Howard's farm, John carried the part into the shed as if it were fragile. Howard stared. "You bought that?" "Yes, sir." Howard tackled it slowly. "Looks like trouble." John said it carefully. "Looks like a chance." Howard raised an eyebrow. "You sure you know what you're doing?" John didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on his jeans and studied the part like a doctor examining an x-ray. "I know what it's supposed to do, and I know why it stopped." That afternoon, John took it apart. Piece by piece, he laid everything out on a wooden table. Springs, gears, shafts. He cleaned them with kerosene and an old toothbrush. The rust came off slowly, like layers of time being peeled away. By nightfall, his hands were black with grease. Howard stepped in with a lantern. "You eat." John shook his head. Howard set down a plate of beans and bread. "Machines can wait. You can't."
John ate standing up, his eyes never leaving the metal. For the first time since he had been forced to leave home, he felt focused instead of lost. Days turned into weeks. John worked on the part every spare moment. He used scrap wire to replace broken connections, filed down warped edges by hand, heated metal over a small flame, reshaping it carefully. There was no manual, no blueprint, only memory from textbooks, shop class, and the logic of how motion had to work. Sometimes he failed. He reassembled it once, connected it to a test rig Howard helped him build, and watched it seize completely. John sat on the floor that night, staring at it. "I don't get it," he said quietly. Howard leaned against the doorway. "You ever see a calf learn to walk?" John shook his head. "They fall a lot. Doesn't mean their legs don't work. Just means they haven't learned yet." John nodded slowly. The next morning, he found the mistake, a fraction of an inch, one angle just slightly off. He fixed it. When he turned the crank again, the mechanism moved. Not perfectly, but it moved. John laughed out loud. It was the first time he had laughed. By late summer, the repaired part was ready to be installed. Howard let him attach it to an old farm machine they had given up on months earlier, a machine no one thought would ever run again. John tightened the final bolt with shaking hands. "You want to do the honors?" Howard asked. John nodded. He pulled the lever. The machine coughed, then rattled. Then, like a stubborn animal, it came alive. The sound filled the shed. Howard stared. "Well, I'll be damned." John felt something open in his chest. Not pride, something deeper, belief. That night, he wrote in one of his notebooks, "If I can fix this, I can fix my life." Word spread fast in Redfield. People started bringing broken things. An old pump that wouldn't start, a generator that had been silent for years, a tractor with a stubborn grind. John didn't charge much. Sometimes he didn't charge at all. He just wanted to understand. And every time he fixed something, he felt less like the boy who'd been sent away and more like someone who belonged somewhere. One afternoon, a man at the diner said, "You're that smart kid who fixed Blake's machine." John nodded. "You ought to be in college." John didn't answer. College felt like another planet. Right now, survival was closer. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the wheat fields, John sat outside the shed with Howard. "You ever think about going back?" Howard asked. John knew what he meant. "My stepfather," John said. Howard nodded. John looked at the horizon. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because if I go back now," John said slowly, "it'll be because I need him." Howard waited. "And I don't want that," John continued. "I want it to be because I don't." Howard smiled faintly. "That's a dangerous kind of independence." John smiled back. "It's the only kind I know." That night, John cleaned the engine part again and wrapped it in cloth. It was no longer rust and scrap. It was proof. A piece of metal bought for $5 had given him something his old house never did, a future that made sense. He didn't know where it would lead yet, but he knew this much. The boy who walked away with a suitcase now had something heavier, purpose. And somewhere deep inside the machine he had rebuilt, something else had started running too, hope. By the time fall settled over Redfield, John's name had begun to mean something. Not in the big way, not in newspapers or schools, but in quiet places, barns, sheds, backyards, where old machines waited to be either fixed or forgotten. People didn't call him a mechanic. They called him that smart kid over at Blake's farm. John didn't mind. What he minded was standing still. The repaired machine sat in Howard Blake's shed like a promise that hadn't been fully spoken yet. It could run, it could work, but it wasn't doing much more than proving it could breathe. One evening, as they watched the sun drop behind the fields, John finally said what had been building in his chest for weeks. "Mr. Blake, what if I used it?" Howard didn't look at him right away. He took a slow sip from his coffee mug. "You used it how?" "To farm," John said. "Just a small patch. I don't need much land. I just want to see if it can actually earn something." Howard studied him. "You ever run a field before?" "No, sir." "You ever planted a crop?" "No, sir." Howard nodded slowly. "Then why would I let you try?" John swallowed. "Because you once let me sleep in your shed, and because this machine only works if it works for something." Howard was quiet a long time. Finally he said, "I got 10 acres on the far side of the creek. Soil's not great. I don't use it much." John's heart jumped. "You can try it," Howard continued, "but you don't get free seed. You don't get free mistakes. You lose the crop. That's on you." John nodded. "I understand." Howard looked at him closely. "You sure you're ready to gamble with little you got?" John thought of the suitcase, the junkyard, the $5 engine part. "I already did," he said. They started in early spring. The land by the creek was rough, uneven, stubborn, full of rocks that had to be dug out by hand. John spent mornings working Howard's farm and afternoons clearing his own small plot. His hands blistered, his back ached. But every evening he studied seed catalogs and farming manuals like school books. He asked questions, listened, learned. Howard showed him how to read the sky,
how to feel soil between his fingers, how to know when rain was coming before the clouds arrived. "It's not all machine," Howard said. "It's timing." John nodded. Timing made sense. It was just another kind of system. They planted corn. The machine John had rebuilt rattled across the field like a stubborn old mule, but it moved. It dug furrows. It planted rows. When the last seed went in the ground, John stood there staring at the dirt. It didn't look like much, but neither had that engine part in the junkyard. The first month, nothing happened. John walked the field every morning before work. He looked for green. He saw only brown. He started doubting himself. By the second month, small shoots pushed through the soil. Thin, fragile, real. John felt something tighten in his chest. He'd fixed metal before, but this was different. This was life. Summer brought heat and worry. One week, the rain didn't come. John stood at the edge of the field, hands on his hips, watching leaves curl inward like tired fingers. "What if it fails?" he asked Howard one night. Howard didn't sugarcoat it. "Then you learn." "But I need it to work." Howard nodded. "So does every farmer." They prayed for rain the way people prayed for mercy. When it came hard. A storm that shook windows and turned the creek into a brown ribbon of rushing water. John ran outside in the downpour, laughing like a fool. By late summer, the corn stood tall. Not perfect, not uniform, but alive. John worked harder than he ever had. He woke before dawn, fed Howard's animals, fixed small machines for neighbors, then went to his field. Some days he barely spoke. The work felt heavy, but the purpose felt heavier. For the first time in his life, no one could send him away from what he was building. Harvest came faster than he expected. They borrowed a small combine from a neighbor. The machine groaned its way across John's 10 acres like an old man climbing stairs. Corn poured into the hopper. John stood there counting rows, heart pounding with every pass. When it was over, they weighed the yield. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough. After selling the crop and paying for seed and fuel, John had more money in his pocket than he'd ever had at once. Not a fortune, but proof. He bought himself a second-hand bed and a real blanket, and for the first time since leaving home, he had something that was his. Word spread. That kid's farming now. That kid fixed Blake's old machine and made it work. People who had once looked past him now nodded when he walked by. At the diner, a man said, "You got a good head on your shoulders, son." John thanked him, but inside he felt something else. Distance. Because as much as the town saw him now, the house he'd left still felt like a locked door. One afternoon, as John loaded tools into the shed, Howard said, "You hear from their stepfather?" John shook his head. "You miss him?" John didn't answer right away. "I miss what I thought a father was supposed to be," he said finally. Howard nodded. "That don't always come from blood." John looked at the field. "I don't want to go back until I don't need to," he said. Howard smiled. "You're getting there." That winter, John used his earnings to buy more parts, more scrap, more broken machines. He fixed what he could. He studied what he couldn't. Every night he wrote in his notebooks ideas for improving engines, for making old machines work better instead of replacing them. He wasn't just surviving now. He was planning. By the next spring, Howard surprised him. "You want more land?" John stared. "You serious?" "I seen what you did with 10 acres. Try 20. John's stomach twisted. 20 acres meant risk. More seed, more fuel, more pressure. "What if I lose it?" Howard shrugged. "Then you'll still be smarter than you were before." John thought of the junkyard, the engine part, the first field. "Okay," he said. The machine started on the first bowl. John listened to it run, steady and rough and honest. It didn't know it had been scrapped once. It only knew how to work. And for the first time, John realized something that surprised him. He didn't feel like the boy who'd been sent away. He felt like someone who had chosen where he stood. A boy with a machine, a field, and a future that finally looked like something he can build. By the time John turned 18, the land across the creek no longer looked like a gamble.
It looked like something real. The rows were straighter now. The machine he had rebuilt no longer rattled like it might fall apart at any moment. It still sounded rough, but it sounded dependable, like a man who'd been through trouble and learned how to stand. Anyway, John worked harder than ever, but the work felt different. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was direction. That was when the past showed up. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when the heat pressed down on the fields, and even the cicadas sounded tired. John was tightening a bolt on the old machine when he saw a car pull up the long dirt drive. A dark sedan, clean, out of place. He wiped his hands on his jeans and shaded his eyes. The driver's door opened, and out stepped the man who had told him to leave. His stepfather stood there in a pressed shirt, one hand on the car door, scanning the farm like he was trying to decide if it was worth his time. John felt his chest tighten for a moment. The smell of oil and dust disappeared. He was back in that narrow kitchen, back with a suitcase at his feet, and nowhere to go. Howard came out of the barn, saw the car, and slowed. "Friend of yours?" Howard asked quietly. John swallowed. Used to be. The man walked closer, his shoes kicking up small clouds of dirt. Well, he said, forcing a smile, you look busy. John didn't answer. You didn't leave a forwarding address, the man went on. Took me some asking around to find you. John crossed his arms. What do you want? The words came out colder than he meant them to. The man cleared his throat. Your mother would have wanted us to keep in touch. John's jaw tightened. My mother would have wanted me to stay. Silence stretched between them. Howard took a step back, giving them space. The man glanced at the field. So, you're farming now? John nodded once. People say you're good with machines. John didn't respond. You always were smart, the man said, just stubborn. John felt something rise in his throat. Not anger, something older. You told me I was smart enough to take care of myself, John said, so that's what I did. The man shifted his weight. It wasn't personal. John let out a short, humorless laugh. It felt personal. They stood there with the sun burning down on them, two men who had once shared a house and now shared nothing but memory. Finally, the man said, I thought maybe now that you're doing okay, we could talk. About what? John asked. The man hesitated. About coming back. The word hit John like a stone. Back? He repeated. You could help with the shop. We could use your head for numbers. You don't have to stay in the shed anymore. John stared at him. The house that had pushed him out now wanted him back, not as a son, but as a worker. John looked past the man at the field, at the machine he had rebuilt, at the dirt under his boots. I don't live in your house anymore, John said quietly. I live here. The man frowned. You don't have to be proud. John felt heat rush to his face. This isn't pride. This is mine. The man sighed. You're making this harder than it needs to be. John's voice rose. You made it hard when you told me to leave. That was when the man's patience cracked. You were a burden, he snapped. Always taking things apart, always in your head. We had a family to think about. The words landed like a slap. John stood very still. Then he said, so did I. The man seemed to realize what he'd said. He looked away. I came to offer you a way back. John shook his head. You came because people told you I was doing well. Silence again. Howard cleared his throat from a distance. You done? The man looked at Howard, then back at John. You're really going to stay out here? He asked. John nodded. Yes. The man exhaled slowly. You always did think you knew better. John met his eyes. I had to. The man turned back toward his car. Don't wait too long, he said over his shoulder. Life doesn't give second chances. John watched him drive away. The dust settled, and with it came a wave of feeling John hadn't expected. Not victory, not relief, grief. That night, John sat alone on the steps of the shed. Howard joined him with 2 mugs of coffee. You okay? Howard asked. John stared at the ground. I thought if he ever came back, it would feel different. How so? Like it would fix something. Howard nodded slowly. Sometimes the person you want to change can't. John rubbed his face with his hands. He didn't come because he missed me. He came because I turned out useful. Howard said nothing. I don't know why that hurts more, John added. Howard put a hand on his shoulder. Because you wanted to matter before you proved you could. John looked up. Does that ever go away? Howard shrugged. It gets quieter. They sat there listening to crickets and the soft ticking of cooling metal. I don't hate him, John said finally. I just don't want to be him. Howard smiled faintly. Then don't be. The next few weeks were hard. John worked, but his mind wandered. He replayed the conversation over and over, hearing different versions of the same sentence. You were a burden. Shh. He pushed himself harder in the fields, as if sweat could burn away memory. One afternoon, the machine stalled in the middle of a row. John slammed his fist against the hood. Stupid thing, he muttered. Howard watched him. You mad at the machine or something else? John didn't answer. That night, he opened one of his notebooks and wrote, If I go back, it's because I want to, not because I need to. The words steadied him. By fall, the second harvest was better than the first. Not perfect, but strong. John counted his earnings twice, then 3 times. For the first time, he saw something he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. Independence. Not just from the house he'd left, but from the feeling that he had to be accepted to exist. One Sunday morning, a boy from town came to the farm with a broken motor in the back of the truck. My dad says you can fix anything, the boy said. John smiled faintly. Not anything, but you'll try. John nodded. I'll try. As he took the motor apart, he saw himself in the boy's eyes. Curious, unsure, hopeful, and something inside him shifted. He wasn't just surviving now. He was becoming someone others looked to. That felt heavier than any field he'd planted. Late that night, John walked out to the machine he had rebuilt from scrap.
He ran his hand along the metal. "You didn't need them," he said quietly. "You just needed to work." The machine, of course, said nothing, but in its silence, John heard something he hadn't before. Confidence. Not loud, not proud, just as steady, the kind that didn't need permission. After his stepfather drove away, something in John changed. Not on the outside. The field still needed tending. The machine still needed oil and bolts and patient hands. But inside, a quiet line had been drawn. Shh. He was no longer working just to survive. He was working to build something that belonged to him, and slowly to others. That winter, John barely left the shed. Snow packed against the doors. Wind howled through the cracks in the wood. Inside, the old machine parts lay spread out across benches like bones waiting for a second life. John rebuilt carburetors, reinforced worn gears, experimented with small improvements, tiny changes that made old machines run smoother than they ever had. Howard Blake watched him one night and said, "You don't just fix things, you make them better." John shrugged. "They already did the hard part. I just helped them remember." By spring, word had spread beyond Redfield. Farmers from neighboring towns started showing up with pickups full of broken equipment. A stalled thresher, a generator that hadn't run since the war, a tractor that coughed and died every time it climbed a hill. John didn't advertise. He didn't need to. People talked. He doesn't replace parts unless he has to. He listens to the engine. He treats old machines like they still matter. He charged fair prices, sometimes less than fair. If someone couldn't pay, he fixed it anyway and told them to bring eggs or corn later. Howard warned him, "You're running a business whether you mean to or not." John hadn't thought of it that way, but when he looked around the shed, he saw shelves filling with tools he'd bought himself. He saw notebooks stacked high with ideas. He saw money in a tin box hidden under a loose floorboard. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just reacting to what had happened to him. He was choosing what came next. That year, he planted more land. 20 acres became 30, then 40. Not all at once, not recklessly. John remembered too well what it felt like to have nothing. He expanded slowly, carefully, like a man testing ice before stepping out too far. The machine he had rebuilt from junkyard scrap became the backbone of everything. It pulled, planted, hauled, and turned like it had been waiting its whole life to be useful. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the fields gold, Howard said, "You know, you could leave now if you wanted." John frowned. "Leave? You've got skills. You've got money. You could go somewhere bigger." John thought about it. He thought about college towns, about factories, about cities with street lights and buses and buildings taller than silos. Then he looked at the machine, the field, the barn. "I don't want to leave what I built," he said. Howard nodded. "That's how you know it's yours." The town began to see John differently, not as the boy who'd been sent away, as the young man who'd stayed. At the diner, people saved him a seat. At church, someone always shook his hand. Kids lingered near the shed, watching him work. One boy named Caleb showed up every Saturday. "You really fixed that from junk?" Caleb asked, staring at the engine. John smiled. "Yeah." Caleb's eyes went wide. "Can you teach me?" John hesitated. Teaching felt heavier than fixing.
Machines didn't care if you failed them. People did. But he remembered what it had felt like to have no one explain things to him. So he said yes. He showed Caleb how to clean parts, how to listen for misfires, how to respect what could crush you if you got careless. Soon, another boy joined, then another. They didn't just learn about machines. They learned how to stay patient, how to try again. Howard watched them from the barn and said, "Looks like you're growing more than corn now." John laughed. "I guess I am." That fall, the harvest was strong, better than any year before. John paid for seed and fuel and still had enough left over to buy a small piece of land near the creek. Just a few acres, but it was his. The deed felt heavy in his hands, not because of the paper, because of what it meant. No one could take this away from him. No one could tell him to leave. That night, he sat alone on the porch of the shed, staring at the stars. He thought about his mother, about what she would have said if she could see him now. He whispered into the dark, "I stayed." But growth didn't come without pressure. The more he owned, the more he had to lose. One summer, rain came too late. The corn grew thin. Machines broke at the wrong time. John lay awake at night, running numbers in his head. What if the crop failed? What if the engine died? What if all this disappeared as fast as it had started? Howard found him one night sitting on a crate staring at the machine. "You can't scare yourself into stopping," Howard said,
but you can scare yourself into planning. John nodded. I just don't want to go back to being nothing. Howard's voice softened. You were never nothing. John didn't answer, but he believed it more than he used to. That year, a woman from town came to the shed with a broken washing machine motor in the back of her truck. Can you fix it? She asked. I can't afford a new one. John looked it over. Probably. She hesitated. I don't have much money. John smiled. Then pay me when you can. She came back a week later with a basket of bread and jam. John took it and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just business. It was connection. The same kind of connection that had kept him alive when he had nothing. One evening, as the fields darkened and the cicadas started up again, Howard said, You know what you're building, right? A farm? John guessed. Howard shook his head. A place people can come when things break. John thought of the junkyard part. The machine, the boy, Caleb, the woman with the washing motor. He saw the pattern. Broken things didn't scare him. They called to him. By the end of that year, John was no longer just the boy with the strange talent. He was the man people trusted. Trusted with their tools, trusted with their work, trusted with their kids' curiosity. The machine he had bought for a few dollars and rebuilt with cold hands and stubborn hope still sat in the center of the shed. He never sold it, never traded it. When someone offered to buy it, he said no. It wasn't just metal. It was the beginning. Late one night, John stood alone in the shed, oil lamp flickering beside him. He placed his hand on the old engine and said quietly, You gave me a place. The engine, silent and steady. He said nothing. But outside the fields waited. And inside, John, something new had taken root. Not just independence, responsibility. The weight of knowing that what he built now could help others stand. The way he once had to. And in that weight, he found something stronger than survival. Purpose. By the time John turned 24, people in Redfield stopped calling him the kid with the machines. They called him Mr. Miller. The change felt strange to him. He still slept light, still woke before dawn, still kept his notebook stacked by the bed in case an idea showed up in the middle of the night. But his days were fuller now. Fields to plant, engines to fix, boys to teach, neighbors to help. And something else had begun to grow alongside the farm. A life. He met Grace Harper on a Sunday afternoon at the county fair. Her father's generator had gone quiet during a storm the night before, and she was the one who drove it to John's shed in the back of an old pickup truck. She stood there with her hands on her hips while John listened to the engine. You always stare at things like that before you touch them? She asked. I'm listening, John said. She raised an eyebrow. It's a machine, not a person. Machines talk, John said. Most people just don't hear them. Grace laughed. It wasn't polite laughter. It was the kind that came out before she could stop it. That was how it started. She brought the generator. Then she brought cookies. Then she started bringing herself. Grace taught second grade in town. She grew up on a small farm 2 counties over. She knew what dust felt like on bare ankles and what it meant to make something last longer than it was supposed to. They talked about simple things at first. Weather, kids, broken engines, why people stayed in small towns when they could leave. Then one evening, sitting on the steps of the shed with the fields dark around them, she asked him about his family. John told her the truth, about his mother, about the kitchen, about the suitcase. Grace didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said, You didn't run away. No, John said. I got pushed, she nodded. And you built a place to land. Her words stayed with him. Marriage came quietly. No big church wedding, no band, no white gloves. Just Grace in a simple dress. Howard Blake standing beside John like a proud, stiff-backed witness, and a preacher who had known John since he was sleeping in the shed. Afterward, they ate fried chicken and pie in the barn. Grace moved into the small farmhouse near the creek, the one John had fixed roof first, then walls, then floors. On their first night there, she walked through each room slowly. It's not fancy, John said. She touched the windowsill, then the doorframe. It's solid. That mattered more to her. The farm grew. So did the people around it. Caleb, the boy who used to watch John work, was now tall enough to lift engines without asking. Another kid, Marcus, joined on weekends. Then Jenny, who liked wiring more than gears. John didn't plan on becoming a teacher. It just happened. He showed them how to clean parts, how to wait before forcing anything, how to accept when something didn't work and try again. Grace watched them from the porch and said, You're building more than machines. John knew she was right. But not everything grew easily. One winter, prices dropped. Crops didn't sell the way they used to. Repairs were fewer. Money felt thin again. John lay awake at night doing numbers in his head. What if this falls apart? He asked Grace once. She rolled onto her side. Then we fix what we can. What if it's too big? Then we fix what we can reach. That was the thing about Grace. She didn't pretend fear didn't exist. She just didn't let it drive. That spring, they found out she was pregnant. John stood in the kitchen holding the test in his hand like it was a live wire. I don't know how to be a father, he said. Grace leaned against the counter. You already are. To who? To every kid you've taught. To yourself. The words scared him and steadied him. When their son Thomas was born, John cried harder than he had when the machine first ran. He held the tiny bundle and thought of the kitchen, the suitcase, the words, you're old enough to take care of yourself. He whispered, you'll never hear that from me. Grace squeezed his hand. Years passed. The farm doubled, then doubled again. Not through luck, through patience, through not borrowing more than he could pay, through fixing instead of replacing, through remembering what it felt like to lose everything before he'd ever owned it. People asked him why he kept the old machine, the one he'd rebuilt from junkyard scrap, when he could afford newer, better ones. John always gave the same answer. 'Cause it still works. That wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that the machine remembered with him. He remembered when he had nothing, but a head full of diagrams and a heart full of questions. One afternoon, years after the visit, John saw a familiar car pull onto the dirt drive. Not the same one, older, rest on the door. His stepfather stepped out. Slower now, thinner. John didn't feel the rush of anger he expected, just a quiet tightening in his chest. Grace stood beside him on the porch. Do you want me to come shiver? She asked. John shook his head. I need to hear him first. The man walked closer. I heard you did well, he said. John nodded. They stood in silence. I was wrong, the man said finally. John didn't answer. I didn't know what to do with you, the man went on. You were always in your head, always taking things apart. John thought of engines, of fields, of kids with oil on their hands. That's what I do, he said. The man nodded. I see that now. There was no apology, but there was no fight either. John felt something loosen inside him. Not forgiveness, acceptance. They didn't hug, they didn't reconcile. But when the man left, John didn't feel like a boy standing in a doorway anymore. He felt like a man standing in his own yard. That night, he walked out to the shed and ran his hand along the old machine. He thought of his mother, of Howard Blake, of Grace, of the kids who came after school, of Thomas sleeping in the farmhouse. He realized something then. Success wasn't the acres. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the machines. It was the choice he had made again and again. To keep what mattered. To keep people. To keep the work honest. To keep broken things from staying broken. Later, sitting at the table with Grace, he said, I don't want Thomas to think success is leaving. Grace smiled. What do you want him to think it is? Staying, John said. And building. She reached for his hand.
Then that's what he'll learn. On the wall of the shed above the old machine, John hung a small sign he painted himself. It read, Fix what you can, keep what matters. The kids asked what it meant. John said, It means your hands are useful, your mind is useful, and your past doesn't get to decide your future. They nodded, not fully understanding, but they would, someday. As summer faded into fall, John stared at the edge of the field with Thomas on his shoulders, Grace beside him in the old machine idling nearby. He looked at what he had built. Not just land, not just engines, a place where things could start again. And he knew the story wasn't finished yet, because what he had kept, family, work, purpose, was about to be tested one more time, not by loss, but by what he chose to pass on. The old machine still started on the first pull. That was what surprised people the most. Not the size of John's farm, not the rows of crops stretching past the creek, not even the small workshop full of tools and half-finished engines. It was the sound, that low, uneven rumble of a machine that had once been scrap metal in a junkyard and now worked like it belonged in the world again. John started it every spring before planting season, not because he had to, because he wanted to remember. When Thomas turned 16, John took him into the shed early one morning. The sun was barely up. Dust floated in the light coming through the windows. The old machine sat in the center of the room like it always had. This, John said, placing his hand on the metal, is where everything started. Thomas studied it. It doesn't look special. John smiled. That's what everyone thought. He told his son the story the same way he told it to the kids who came to learn, and the same way he told Grace years before.
About the junkyard, about the $5, about fixing something nobody wanted. I thought I was buying a machine part, John said, but I was really buying time, a chance, a direction. Thomas ran his fingers along the bolts. You could have sold it. I was offered money for it, John said, more than I'd ever paid for anything in my life. Why didn't you? John looked around the shed. Because if I sold it, he said, I might forget who I was when I fixed it. Years passed the way seasons always do. Quietly, steadily. The farm grew, the workshop grew, the number of people who came through the doors grew too. Caleb had his own small operation now. Marcus worked at a repair shop in the next town. Jenny studied engineering and still came home on weekends to help rewire engines. Grace said once, "You built a future without meaning to." John corrected her. "I built one because I remembered what it felt like not to have one." One fall, a local paper asked to do a story. They photographed John standing next to the old machine. The headline read, "From Scrap to Soil, One Man's Farm Built from a $5 Part." People from outside Redfield started showing up. Some came to see the machine, some came to ask questions, some came because they were stuck and didn't know what else to do. One boy stood in the doorway one afternoon, nervous and thin, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "My dad says you used to be like me," he said. John raised an eyebrow. "What's like you?" "I don't have anywhere to go," the boy said. John felt something old stir in his chest. He handed the boy a wrench. "You know how to clean a carburetor?" The boy shook his head. "Then today's a good day to learn." The machine became more than a tool. It became a lesson. John took it to the high school once a year and parked it out front. He'd stand in the gym and say, "This thing was considered useless once. It didn't look valuable, it didn't work, but it still had something inside it worth fixing." The students always got quiet at that part. "People are the same way," he'd say, "and so are chances." One evening, sitting on the porch with Grace, John watched Thomas and his younger sister chasing fireflies near the shed. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Grace asked. John shook his head. "I used to." "What changed?" "I realized leaving isn't the same as moving forward," he said. Grace smiled. "That sounds like something you'd put on a sign." John laughed. "I already did." Inside the shed, the old sign still hung above the machine. "Fix what you can't. Keep what matters." Not everything healed. John never became close with his stepfather. They never shared holidays. They never rebuilt what was broken between them, but something else had been rebuilt instead. A pattern, a way of living. John didn't measure success by how much land he owned anymore. He measured it by how many people left his shed believing they could fix something in their own lives. On the 40th anniversary of the day he bought that engine part, John stood alone in the shed. He started the machine. The engine coughed, then settled into its familiar rhythm. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was 17 again, standing in a junkyard, holding a piece of rusted metal and wondering if it could change anything. He opened his eyes and looked at what had grown from that moment. Fields, family, students, stories. Not from luck, from patience, from refusal to throw things away just because they look broken. That night, he sat with Thomas at the kitchen table. "Someday," John said, "this machine will be yours." Thomas nodded. "I'll keep it running." "That's not what I mean," John said. "I mean keep what it stands for, running." Thomas frowned. "What's that?" John thought for a second. "That small beginnings matter, that broken things deserve a chance, and that you don't need permission to build a life." Thomas smiled. "You should tell people that." John shrugged. "I do, every time I start it." And now that brings the story to you, because maybe you're not fixing machines, maybe you're fixing something else. A job that fell apart, a family that broke, a future that didn't turn out the way you planned. So here's the question for you. What's the $5 part in your life right now? What's the small overlooked thing you could fix that might change everything? Do you think broken beginnings can really lead to strong endings, or do you believe some things are too far gone? John's story says this: sometimes the thing everyone throws away is the very thing that teaches you who you are. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that small chances can grow into real lives, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about resilience, second chances, and ordinary people who build extraordinary lives from almost nothing. And tell us in the comments, what would you try to fix if you were given just one small chance? Because somewhere out there, a broken machine, a broken plan, or a broken moment might be waiting for you to turn the future.